Maybe I lasted longer than I probably would have based on my views on France. And it's not even my view, it's basically stating the facts in terms of what France is doing to Africa.
What they're currently doing?
What they're currently doing and have been doing for decades since the quote-unquote independence of the former French colonies, yes.
So what is happening? Because look, the reality is a lot of Americans are not necessarily hearing about what's happening in African nations. 7 of the top 10 fastest growing economies come from Africa, but you also have a significant impact of the Chinese in many African countries as well. And so do you believe that the government of France still has a lot of control over a number of African nations, of their former colonies?
They have significant control over all of their former colonies, specifically 14 of them. Just to give you the highlights of what they did when they were giving the independence, so to speak, to their former colonies. They forced them to sign a document which they are calling the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. You have to understand, on one hand, they are saying we're giving you independence, which turned out to be mostly political independence, but that you also have to sign this document, which is titled the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. So you're going to be independent, but you have to agree to continue to be colonized. So 2 countries said absolutely not. We are not going to sign those that document.
Those 2 countries?
Mali and Guinea.
Okay.
And what the French did, they went into those 2 countries, took everything that they thought they had brought to those 2 economies, poured concrete into the sewage pipes, and completely devastating the 2 economies. This was done as a way of letting the other countries know that if you do not sign this document, this is the fate that awaits you.
How has that negatively impacted those African countries?
It has impacted them terribly, terribly, terribly. If you look at it, you give up the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization said those countries were expected to deposit 85% of their bank reserves back then with the French Central Bank under the control of the French Minister of Finance. And should those countries wish to request some of those monies, because remember they were only left with 15% of their reserves, then they would have to submit a financial statement for the country, and if approved, they could only access up to 20% of whatever they had deposited the year before as a loan at commercial interest rates. The only difference now is the 85% deposits have now been lowered down to maybe between 50 and 60%. But the countries are still forced and required to deposit their bank reserves with the French Central Bank. So picture this situation. You are depositing all your monies with France. Should you need some of your money, you get it as a loan at commercial interest rates. So immediately you have a credit with France, but you begin to owe France. This has been going on and continues to this day. So combined, the 14 countries are giving to France cash, cold hard cash, over $500 billion every year. And France takes that money and invests it in its own stock market under the French name, and the countries may or may not know the returns. Currently, for every 14 billion that France takes out of Africa, by the time they finish investing it in the French stock market, they are realizing upwards of 300 billion. So you do the math to see how much money France is taking out of Africa every year. And yet France has the audacity to then look at African countries and call them poor countries. Why would poor African countries give $500 billion to France year in and year out? What really gets me the most is, how does the world sit back and watch this carnage take place in Africa? Where is the United Nations? This is the body that's supposed to be looking out for any violations of human rights. It is my humble opinion that singularly, what France is doing to Africa is the biggest violation of human rights. Women and children are dying of starvation, youth unemployment, when the same poor countries are giving $500 billion to France. It simply does not make any sense. And I don't know how the world can sit back and watch all this unfold and nobody is saying anything. It's unacceptable.
Hello family, this is African Esquire TV and I'm your host Tony Cherie. So we have great news coming from the African continent this week, and that is coming particularly from the country of Benin. If you have not heard already, the president of Benin has announced that they are going to withdraw the national reserves of that country from the French National Bank. And if you don't know why this is significant, basically, since the French former Francophone countries were decolonized, France has been able to maintain colonization of these African countries by enforcing a number of rules. So, of course, colonization was an official regime where it is official that you are a subject of the French government. However, we're going to let you free. We're going to let you do, what you want, and to an extent. However, you have to do a number of things in order for us to allow you this freedom. Now, one of the things that the French government required of those countries was that they deposit, at the time it was about 80% of their national reserves into the French National Bank. And of course, if you're a country trying to develop, the fact that you have to take your money as a country and put it into another country's bank severely limits you. It basically puts you in a point where you can never succeed. You can never be dependent. You can never be independent from that government. You can never have self-actualization, self-realization, self-determination, none of those things, because you're always going to be beholden to the person who controls your money. And there were a number of other things. If you watch this channel for a number of times, you've probably heard me talk about things such as the French government having military control over former Francophone countries. They also have enforced their own currency inside of these countries called the CFA franc. So all of these things have created a condition inside of these countries where these people are poor, these people are suffering, these people are without autonomy, and the international community has basically turned their eyes and pretended they did not see this happening. However, we know that France as a government is only able to exist and only able to be a national power because of their exploitation of Africa. French presidents have said this a number of times that France is dependent on Africa. That relationship between Africa, which is a relationship of exploitation, is a relationship that keeps the French government sustained. So this is the conditions that created today. But today we have some very significant news that the president of Benin has decided to withdraw money from the French bank. Now, we're going to read an article and we're going to talk about what this decision actually means. So this article is from Tarifa, and the title is Benin President Orders Economic Decolonization from France. For the first time, a head of state from Africa's CFA currency region has openly spoken about a very politically and economic sensitive subject that could ruin the relationship with a colonial master, France. President Patrice Talon has ordered that his country's foreign currency reserves, colonially deposited in French central bank, be immediately withdrawn. Such a decision has been a taboo, and no other French colony has ever done this. All CFA franc zone countries are former colonies of France and have historically deposited their foreign exchange reserves to Banque de France. This has been an unchangeable rule for decades, but the Benin leader seems to have a different route he wants to take his country. These reserves are an insurance that guarantees that the stability of the CFA and therefore the control of inflation. In early October, French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire said Paris was open to an ambitious reform of the CFA franc and that it was up to the countries that share the currency to decide what they want. Just a side note, so again, this is a French minister saying, okay, we're going to be willing to reform this franc. Why are they doing this? Because if you don't know, on social media, a lot of people have become knowledgeable about this situation. So previously, a lot of people did not know, me included. I didn't know that this was going on as far as in former Francophone countries. And a lot of people assumed that, colonization of this type had been abolished. However, with the internet, with social media, a lot of people are talking about this. A lot of people have been spreading the word. We have a lot of activists rising up inside of these countries that are formerly colonized by France. And a lot of people are basically calling out the French government for their hypocrisy on a number of issues, their blatant exploitation, their blatant colonialism. A lot of people are calling them out, and a lot of the civilians on the ground are actually showing backlash. A lot of people have been saying, we want to be done with the CFA franc. We're done with this currency. This currency is exploiting our people. We want our own currency. So basically, the tide is turning, and as racism does, institutional racism always does, whenever people are starting to protest, whenever people are starting to talk about issues, whenever people are starting to rebel, instead of get rid of the issue, instead of, we'll get rid of this currency, they try to reform it, because reform is basically racism's answer to anything that tries to stand up against its reign. So they're not going to say we're going to abolish the currency. They're going to try to do something to pacify you. So that's really what's happening, is that they're trying to pacify a lot of the outcry from people inside of these countries. So keep going. Countries in the Western African Economic Bloc are introducing a new currency known as ECO, and will replace other currencies in this part of the continent, which unavoidably will affect the colonial CFA currency. However, international law experts argue that the decision by President Talon may encounter some legal hurdles before his decision is effected. The Marshall Zebelinga, an expert who says that there is a legal framework that sets obligations to raise at least 50% of the reserves to the French Treasury. Now there is a political decision. So yes, this shows you in itself that the CFA franc is a colonial currency, because the fact that the countries that are supposed to be sovereign, supposed to be independent, have come to the decision that they want to separate from this currency. There should not be any legal hurdles to separating, hypothetically, if you're sovereign, if you're independent. However, the fact is they have to, funny enough, they're supposed to fight for their right to actually have a different currency than the French currency, which shows you that this is not something that is done with freedom in mind. This is something that was done to and continue to bind the countries that were colonized by France to that regime. It says it will be necessary to negotiate, to enter into discussion to get the African reserves out of the treasury. So it may take a while, but the process is ongoing. So you know that they're going to try to find some way to stop this country from doing it. French politicians say Talon's move to withdraw from Banque de France may also trigger a political blockade. For a long time, 100% of the reserves in the CFA area were kept in the French treasury, and even when we went to 65% in the 1970s, African central banks continued to pay almost 100% to the French treasury anyway. So anyways, it's an annuity, and it is part of the colonial rents, undoubtedly. We must build we must build win-win games now, and old models will not work. So basically, we see what's happening. The president of Benin is doing something very bold. He's doing something that is obviously going to have the potential for mass repercussions for him. So one thing we're going to talk about, first of all, is that we as the African diaspora, the Africans on the continent, the international African Pan-African community have to pay very close attention to what's happening as far as the French reaction to the president, because President Talon basically has put himself inside of a place where he's going to be a target. And the targeting could happen a number of ways. It can be from economic sanctions. It can be from demonization. He could be labeled a terrorist now, and now there's going to be an invasion of Benin because of some reason that doesn't pertain to the other countries that are under the French rule, because they want to basically do whatever they can in order to maintain dominance. So we have to pay very close attention and be very watchful. However, I think that this can have the potential to definitely unravel the French hold on the region. And France, they're always obviously going to respond militarily, and that's why I said we have to keep a close watch. However, as Benin actually goes forward with this, the other countries that are neighboring Benin, the other former Francophone countries, are going to do the same, because there's no logic to actually continuing this relationship where you're going to put your money into the French bank. And it's not going to be the politicians, the presidents, who are going to be the ones to drive this movement. It's going to be the people who drive the movement, because the people are the ones who are actually waking up. The people are the ones that are going to the streets. The people are the ones who are protesting and rioting. And they, I believe, are going to be the ones to completely shift the the atmosphere and completely change the French colonization of Africa. But again, as far as us in the diaspora, our job is to be very watchful. We have to be watchdogs in this, because we have to understand that if we aren't watchful, that they're going to do something to basically try to stop this from happening. They're going to do something to destabilize that country, destabilize their ability to free themselves from the CFA franc, from the national reserves, from withdrawing them from the national reserves. They're going to try to do something. And we know that they do things behind the back. For example, we know that they were fired the ambassador to the United States from the African Union for speaking out about France. Now, they're not going to do that out in the open. They're going to go behind closed doors and talk to their puppets and say, hey, we're not liking how this woman is talking, so you need to do something to basically take her out of position. And this is how they operate, because they're very careful not to give the appearance of being of being a colonial master. So they'll go behind the scenes and talk to their people behind closed doors, talk to their puppets, talk to people who they have pull with. And that's what they're going to do in this situation, which is why I say that African people, we have to be very vigilant in actually watching and making sure that the French regime does not do anything to destabilize Benin. We have to basically pray for President Talon and make sure that we're doing our part as far as raising hell if they do something that's going to jeopardize those people. So that's basically all I have on this. This is great news, and I do think that this is going to have the potential to completely change a lot of things in Africa. And I want to just, end out with one last thing, and just remember, we don't see everything happening at once, but we have to understand that we are going forward. And the proof that things are going forward is because we become conscious of a number of things. We're becoming conscious of neocolonialism. We become conscious of French colonialism, which to me goes beyond neocolonialism. And these things are the things that are going to ensure that we do not go back, but that we go forward. So as has been said by many of our leaders, we are definitely progressing. We are definitely going forward. Pan-Africanism is very well alive and very well doing its job. However, we have to continue on with the struggle, because otherwise we're going to recede if we do not continue to make ourselves conscious and continue to fight our own battles. So that's all I have on this. I would love to see your guys' response and your thoughts, because this is something very powerful, the fact that he's going to withdraw his national reserves. So give your thoughts, give your opinion, and I will see you guys in the next video.
Malcolm,
Are you prepared to go into the United Nations at this point and ask that charges be brought against the United States for its treatment of American Negroes?
Oh, yes. Please. I think you're right in my opinion. The audience will have to be quiet. Yes, as I pointed out when I was during my traveling, that African nations and Asian nations and Latin American nations look very hypocritical when they stand up in the United Nations condemning the racist practices of South Africa and that which is practiced by Portugal and Angola, and saying nothing in the UN about the racist practices that are manifest every day against Negroes in this society. Even in South Africa, those Africans aren't faced with bayonets and aren't faced with police dogs. And when I was in Beirut, I saw a picture on the front page of a Negro being beaten in Tennessee, on the front page of the paper in Beirut. When I got to Cairo, I saw the same picture of a Negro being beaten in Tennessee. When I got to Lagos, I saw the same picture. So were these African nations knowing the brutality that is inflicted upon black people in this country, simply because those black people are trying to get what the Supreme Court said they were supposed to have 10 years ago? I would be not a man. If I was in a position to bring it in front of the United Nations and didn't do so, I wouldn't be a man.
Or whatever. We're facing a global phenomenon of colonialism, and it's being practiced on us the same as being practiced on those outside of the borders of the United States. Now, being someone who is of African descent in the United States, I wanted to start an initiative to actually bring this as a petition to the United Nations. I think it's very important, first of all, to do this. One, because us as a people, we have to start calling it what it is. We have to stop calling it just, oh, we need to fight discrimination, or we need to fight racism. We have to start calling it what it is. We need to fight colonialism. We need to fight the fact that there is a colonial presence in our neighborhoods, in our cities. The fact that we are being exploited on multiple levels and multiple tiers inside of the United States government. We have to start calling it what it is.
700 per 100,000. Nowhere in the world incarcerates as much as we do. We've seen extremely high rates of exposure to the criminal justice system for African American men with very low levels of schooling. So if we think about black men who were born in the late 1970s and who are growing up through the American prison boom of the 1980s and the 1990s, the chances that they're going to serve time in state or federal prison if they dropped out of high school is about 70%. So going to prison for that group of black men with very low levels of schooling, that's become a normal life event. And that's really only happened in the last 10 years. We're at this point now where there's about 1.2 million African American children with a parent who's incarcerated. That's about 1 in 9.
Itself, right? So we want recognition, international recognition, that the actions of the United States are ones that a colonial master would be doing to its subject, and that is what is happening to our people in the United States. So this is a